The rain came down like sheets of iron hammering against the fabric wings until the little biplane shuddered as if it might break apart. Below its wheels, the North Atlantic rose in black heaving mountains, 30, sometimes 40 feet high, each crest reaching up toward the aircraft as if trying to drag it under. The pilot could barely see beyond the edge of his own cockpit. Ice gathered on the goggles faster than he could wipe it away. His hands, numb inside soaked gloves, clung to the control stick as the wind threatened to flip the aircraft with every violent gust. Somewhere ahead, hidden in the storm and darkness, moved the most powerful battleship afloat. A fortress of steel, 8 15-inch guns, armor that could shrug off anything the Royal Navy had thrown at her so far. And yet the only thing standing between that giant and the open Atlantic was this slow, open cockpit biplane, a machine many engineers had dismissed as outdated the day it was built. How did a relic from another era become the one weapon capable of stopping the Bismarck? And why did the world learn on this night that even the most obsolete tools can change history when placed in determined hands, long before the storm over the Atlantic? Long before the Swordfish found itself hunting the Bismarck, in the darkness the story began in a quiet factory outside London. It was 1934 and the world stood on the edge of a new era in naval warfare. Most nations were investing in sleek all-metal monoplanes, symbols of modern speed and industrial pride. Yet inside the design offices of Fairey aviation engineers were sketching something that already looked old. A biplane, fabric skin, open cockpit, fixed landing gear. To many it seemed as if the past had walked into the future by mistake. But for the fleet air arm, the past still held answers the future couldn't yet provide. Britain's carriers were short-decked, their operations often battered by wind spray and violent seas. Aircraft needed to lift heavy torpedoes from runways barely long enough for a truck. They needed forgiving handling in low-visibility, low-speed approaches. They had to be repaired not in pristine hangars, but on rolling decks by sailors with cold hands and limited tools. The Fairey Swordfish, known at first only as TSR-2 Torpedo, spotter reconnaissance was built for these unforgiving realities. Its fabric wings were not a weakness, but a promise they could be patched anywhere with a needle and doped cloth. Its fixed gear removed the risk of hydraulic failure during critical landings. Its open cockpit gave observers full visibility when searching the vast empty ocean for ships that did not want to be found. In an age obsessed with speed, the Swordfish was designed for survival reliability and persistence qualities that mattered far more at sea than raw performance. When the prototype flew in 1934, test pilot Chris Stanley reported that it handled beautifully steady, obedient, impossible to panic. Crews who later trained on it grew attached quickly. It could haul torpedoes, mines, rockets, depth charges, and flares. It could fly in storms that grounded faster machines. And when riddled with bullets, it could limp home with more holes than fabric. By 1939, as Europe fell back into war, the Swordfish entered service not as a showpiece, but as a necessity. 13 squadrons took to the air, tasked with reconnaissance, torpedo strikes, and convoy protection. Most officers knew the aircraft was already obsolete. German fighters were twice as fast. New naval bombers across the world could outrun and outclimb it. But Britain did not have the luxury of waiting. War had begun, and the only torpedo bomber available in numbers was the string bag. Its first taste of combat came over the fjords of Norway in April 1940. Flying between mountain walls, buffeted by wind, the Swordfish dove through anti-aircraft fire to strike German ships at Trondheim. They achieved no decisive hits, but every aircraft came back. The crews learned something vital: the Swordfish was not fragile. It was stubborn, resilient, built not to impress but to endure. And that endurance would soon be tested in a place even older. Empires once feared the dark waters of the Mediterranean, where the next chapter of its story would begin. The Mediterranean was where the Swordfish first proved that an aircraft could be outdated on paper and revolutionary in the air. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, its modern battleships threatened the sea lanes linking Britain to Egypt and the Middle East. Direct confrontation would be costly. Admiral Andrew Cunningham needed something bold, something that could shift the balance without risking his own capital ships. That opportunity lay at Taranto, the heart of the Italian battle fleet. Operation Judgment, planned with precision and a dose of audacity, called for only 21 Swordfish from HMS Illustrious. Their torpedoes had been modified with breakaway wooden fins so they would run shallow instead of burying themselves in the mud of the harbor. On the night of November 11, 1940, the biplanes climbed into a moonless sky. Some carried flares to ignite the night. Others carried bombs to harass defenses. A handful held torpedoes, the weapons that could cripple battleships. When the flares fell, the harbor blazed like day. Italian gunners unleashed thousands of shells as Swordfish wove through the chaos at barely above mast height. In those minutes of violence and white-hot magnesium light, the old biplane achieved what no fleet had ever done. It struck 3 battleships in their own fortified harbor. Conte di Cavour sank to the bottom. Littorio and Caio Duilio were crippled for months. A single squadron had halved Italy's battleship strength without losing more than 2 aircraft. The world took notice. Japanese naval officers walked the docks at Taranto weeks later, studying the holes torn into battleship hulls. The lesson was unmistakable. Air power could reach into any harbor. No anchorage was safe. But for Britain, the next and greatest test would come not in the Mediterranean, but in the cold northern waters, where a new threat had emerged: the German battleship Bismarck. Sleek, fast, heavily armored, she was designed to tear apart the lifeline between Britain and America. When she met at HMS Hood in the Denmark Strait on May 24, 1941, the clash lasted only minutes. A shell found Hood's magazine. In a single monstrous flash, the pride of the Royal Navy broke apart. Only 3 of her 1 to 418 crew survives. The shock was immediate and devastating. Bismarck had to be stopped, not simply defeated. If she escaped into the Atlantic, convoys could be massacred faster than Britain could replace them. Every available British ship surged into the hunt. Yet the ocean was wide-weather savage, and Bismarck as fast as most of her pursuers. The first Swordfish strike, launched from HMS Victorious on the night of May 24, fought through squalls to deliver a single torpedo hit. It caused little structural damage, but it ruptured fuel tanks. Oil streamed behind the battleship like a trail of breadcrumbs across the sea, a trail Britain would follow. What remained was a final chance. HMS Ark Royal, pushing through rising winds and worsening seas, prepared the Swordfish for a second decisive strike. If they failed, Bismarck would reach the safety of French air cover. If they succeeded, one of the most powerful warships ever built might be stopped not by another battleship, but by biplanes that looked like ghosts from a forgotten war. By the evening of May 26, 1941, the weather over the Atlantic had turned vicious, far worse than the night Hood was lost. On HMS Ark Royal, the flight deck pitched so violently that aircraft lurched forward even before their engines reached full power. Yet the Swordfish had to launch. Bismarck was less than a day from the protective umbrella of Luftwaffe fighters based in France. If she reached Brest, the Royal Navy would lose its final chance. The first wave made a tragic mistake through a radar misreading and the chaos of storm clouds. The Swordfish attacked HMS Sheffield, a British cruiser shadowing the German battleship. The error might have been catastrophic, but fate intervened. Rough seas caused the magnetic detonators on the torpedoes to malfunction. They exploded prematurely, sparing Sheffield, and teaching Ark Royale's crews that magnetic fuses could not be trusted in that weather. Within minutes, torpedoes were rearmed with contact detonators for the second decisive strike. At 19, 10 hours 15, Swordfish clawed into the gale once more. Rain blasted into the open cockpits. Visibility fell to just a few yards. Many pilots could not see their own wingtips. In the buffeting wind formation, flying was impossible. Each aircraft fought alone, trusting compass, instinct, and endurance. The storm was so violent that structural failure was a real possibility. Losing the horizon meant losing your life. Yet every pilot pressed on, knowing the future of the Atlantic War might hinge on what happened in the next 2 hours. They found Bismarck at 20:05, silhouetted against clouds, guns blazing. Anti-aircraft fire sheeted into the sky. The battleship's gunners expected modern monoplane bombers. They aimed ahead of where fast aircraft should be. The Swordfish, crawling through the air at little more than 100 miles per hour, slipped beneath the predictive arcs of German fire. The very slowness that made them obsolete saved them. One by one, the biplanes made their runs. Pilots dropped to barely above the waves, then pulled up just enough to release their torpedoes. Spray hit their goggles. Shrapnel clipped their wings. The sea and the enemy fought them in equal measure. 2 torpedoes found their mark. The first struck amidships, damaging armor, but not the vital organs of the ship. The second, however, slammed into the stern. Moments later, the crew of Bismarck reported the unthinkable. The rudder was jammed, locked at about 12 degrees to port. Emergency teams tried everything. Manual overrides, auxiliary systems, even divers in the raging sea. Nothing worked. Bismarck began drifting in slow circles, unable to maneuver, unable to escape. The Swordfish limped back through the storm toward Ark Royal. Landing on a pitching deck in darkness was nearly as dangerous as the attack itself, but every aircraft returned. Every crew survived. Behind them, Britain's battleships were closing in. The next dawn, HMS King George V and HMS Rodney found their prey. Vite. For more than 2 hours, they battered the crippled giant with overwhelming fire. Bismarck fought back, but with her steering destroyed, she was no longer a warship, only a wounded symbol of a fading naval era. At 10:39 a.m., she slipped beneath the waves. More than 2,000 men were lost. Only 115 survived. The cost of naval warfare lay quiet again on the Atlantic floor, and the world understood that it had been a single torpedo from a seemingly obsolete biplane that sealed Bismarck's fate. For Britain, the sinking of the Bismarck was more than a tactical victory. It was a strategic necessity that ensured the island nation could continue fighting. But for the world watching beyond the Atlantic, especially the United States, it carried deeper implications. America had not yet entered the war, but its industries, shipyards, and farms were already feeding Britain's survival. The arsenal of democracy depended on convoys that crossed a vast hostile ocean. If Bismarck had slipped into those shipping lanes, she could have torn the lifeline apart in a matter of weeks. American naval observers studied the pursuit closely. They understood that British capital ships had struggled to track, chase, and pin down the German battleship. In the end, it was not speed or firepower that made the difference. It was the ability of aircraft launched from a carrier to find, fix, and cripple a target that surface ships could not reliably corner. To American strategists, this was not a European footnote. It was a preview of their own future in the Pacific, where vast distances and powerful fleets would meet under unforgiving skies. Taranto had already offered the first warning shot battleships in harbor were no longer safe. The United States Naval Institute published early analyses of the raid, noting the ingenuity required to make aerial torpedoes run in shallow water. A few months later, Pearl Harbor would underscore the lesson with catastrophic force. While the circumstances differed, the principle was identical. Air power had eclipsed the battleship as the decisive arm of naval warfare. But beyond strategy and steel, the story of the Swordfish resonated with American veterans and sailors. For another reason, it reflected a truth deeply embedded in U.S. military culture. Superior equipment matters, but superior people matter more. Training discipline, improvisation, and determination can turn even outdated tools into war-winning assets. The slow, fabric-covered Fairey Swordfish echoed the logic behind countless American stories, from Marine pilots flying matched Wildcats at Midway to destroyer escorts charging U-boats with little more than grit and radar. The world learned a universal lesson from the Bismarck: chase technology cannot guarantee victory, and obsolescence on paper does not mean irrelevance in battle. What decides outcomes then and now is the human will to adapt, endure, and act when it matters most. It was true for British air crews over the Atlantic. It would soon be true for Americans across 2 oceans. Looking back across 8 decades, the Fairey Swordfish seems almost impossible to explain. On paper, it belonged to another century, slower than its enemies, colder and harsher for its crews built of fabric when the world was turning to metal. And yet this unlikely aircraft accomplished feats that reshaped the course of the war. At Taranto, it crippled a modern fleet. In the darkness of the Atlantic, it struck the blow that doomed the Bismarck. In the Mediterranean and the Arctic, it cut supply lines, hunted submarines, and outlasted aircraft designed to replace it. Again and again, the string bag proved that effectiveness is measured not by appearance, but by results. Its legacy is not simply one of battles won or tonnage sunk. It is a reminder of the quiet virtues that often decide the fate of nations: reliability, discipline, and human resolve. The Swordfish succeeded because the men who flew it were trained to excellence and motivated by necessity. They took what they had and found ways to make it enough. In their hands, an outdated biplane became a weapon of precision and perseverance. Their courage carried it through storms, flak, and impossible odds. Their sacrifice, now etched into the history of Taranto, the North Atlantic, and the Channel, gave the aircraft a dignity no specification sheet could capture. For Americans today, the lesson feels familiar. We live in a world obsessed with innovation, where newer is assumed to be better, and speed is mistaken for strength. But the Swordfish reminds us that technology alone never wins a war. It is people, their training, their judgment, their resilience, who define whether tools succeed or fail. And sometimes the tool that seems least impressive becomes the one that history remembers most. As the last surviving swordfish rest in museums, their wings no longer buffeted by wind or spray. One question lingers: what obsolete tools or overlooked strengths in our own lives might still be exactly what we need when the moment comes? If this story of the Fairey Swordfish and the fall of the Bismarck speaks to you, if it reminds you of a lesson a veteran you knew, or a moment when determination mattered more than equipment, feel free to share it below. History continues in the memories we keep and the conversations we pass on. Thank you for watching. The battle may be over, but the history is still being written.